Would you mind like giving a brief overview of what the Cleveland Street scandal was all about for those that have never heard of it?
So yeah, the Cleveland Street scandal was a gay sex scandal in the late Victorian era in 1889, based around a male brothel in Cleveland Street. The story starts with a young messenger boy in London being stopped and investigated by a police officer who worked for the Postal Service because he had money on him that he shouldn't have had. And as a result, he sort of admits that actually he got this money off these men in this brothel. So the police start an investigation of this brothel, which is a very high-end, quite luxurious place for men to go and have sex with other men. And the men who visited this brothel tended to be from the very highest echelons of society, members of the army, House of Lords, House of Commons, things like this. So there was a sort of scandal that emerged around it, in which the investigation becomes quite murky because there's all sorts of figures who are pursued by the police but manage to get away. And also there's the suggestion of even higher ranking figures, including potentially the heir to the British throne. So there's a sort of cover-up at heart, which leads to a sort of press scandal as well, which follows. And it emerges at a very interesting time in the sort of development of the idea of what a homosexual is. There's a sort of moral panic going on in society at the time. So the case is like an amazing petri dish of British class and colonial attitudes and how they intersect with this new rising figure of this strange urban phenomenon of the homosexual man. But you must know the scandal pretty well, James, because you've turned this into your new play, which is called The Flea. Why did you choose this particular story as the focus? And also, why is it called The Flea?
Yeah, so I was commissioned by the Yard a few years back and was speaking with the director, Jay Miller, about maybe setting something in the late Victorian era, because we were both really interested in the way that era is taught, or at least was taught in schools to us, and is perceived as being this kind of, prudish, chaste sort of era where all these sort of modern sensibilities of manners, etc., like all came from. And the reality, which was that it was a huge time of upheaval of sexual politics and the cities expanding, and so these underworlds of what were in the cities completely expanding. And so I went away and I quickly found a mention in a book about the Cleveland Street scandal, and it just sparked something for me, which is, it's sort of, as you say here, it is this kind of incredible petri dish of everything that was going on at the time, from top to bottom. And it spoke as well to a lot of what I think is going on even today, particularly with our relationship to aristocracy and the royal family, and the way that essentially living in a kind of aristocratic democracy trickles down to all of us. And so I was just sort of fascinated by the way this scandal unfolded and in the history books, but also fascinated by what was left out, and like the sort of, and that's like, I mean, that's amazing for a dramatist. It's like this idea, I love stuff like Line of Duty and like, conspiracy dramas and police thrillers and all this sort of stuff that's about trying to find out how things are hushed up. And this, to me, felt like such rich territory. As the play was developed, I hit upon this image of pushing that hierarchy to its limits, and so starting this sort of chain reaction of events with this image of a flea biting a rat, and then that tiny moment being the kind of butterfly flapping its wings that goes all the way up the chain and all the way back down again. And so calling it the flea is this idea that we're all living in a society, means we're all interconnected. And so the actions of those at the top have enormous effects on the actions of those at the bottom without us ever really quite realizing how.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating story as well, because it has these sort of characters in it, at least in a true story, who were at the bottom of society's heap, as it were, and yet took some pretty impressive actions and stood up for themselves in some interesting ways as a force of character, and did have some effect in changing or affecting sort of the attitudes of people towards the scandal and towards gay sex in general.
Yeah, I mean, as you say as well, it came at such an interesting and horrible time for queer history in the UK, and that only 4 years before there was this amendment to an act called the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which essentially criminalized something called gross indecency, which was incredibly vaguely defined, and all of a sudden meant that gay men could be locked up on, on hearsay or trying to procure some form of sex, or it just became a lot easier for the police to lock up homosexual men. And so all of a sudden, over the course of 4 years, this strange, by the time the play set, which is in 1889, this strange kind of moral panic that hadn't really existed before was now in full swing. And so places like Cleveland Street were being set up to kind of give people somewhere to go out, away from all of that, and I don't know, it felt to me like such a, and it's sort of really famously, the Cleveland Street kind of comes at the crux of this, and that the exposition of the scandal then leads to this kind of moral panic being splashed all over the newspapers in lots of ways, and ultimately ending up famously in the trial of Oscar Wilde. And I think that's the point in history that people are more aware of. And this almost feels like in many ways, like the prequel story to that, I think. Huw, would you mind telling me how you've gone about looking into attitudes towards homosexuality in this time period, and in the course of your research, what are the things that surprised or fascinated you the most?
Yeah, I mean, the late Victorian era is probably the most important time in the history of queer history and history of sexuality in terms of the formation of a world that we inhabit today. It's when sort of modernity and sexuality came together. So, it's quite easy to think today, there's always been homosexuals, and the history of homosexuality is simply the suppression of men who identified as gay, or women who identified as gay. But it's not really the case. The idea that there's such a thing as the homosexual, as a social identity, as a thing that you can be, is a late Victorian creation. So the word first emerges in Germany in the 1860s. And before that, there were sodomites, for example, people who were seen to have committed a certain sex act, but the sex act itself was kind of the understanding of the law. And a sort of social understanding. You might sodomize somebody or be sodomized, and that is sinful or criminal. But it's not who you are as a person necessarily. Whereas in the late 1860s, you get this sort of convergence of a criminal discourse, a medicalized discourse, and also a cultural discourse, saying actually these people who do that, these acts, do them because of something about who they are as people, as themselves. So the emergence of the homosexual identity actually really emerges, as we understand it today, in the 1860s and onwards, mainly in Germany and also in the UK. So it's a really interesting time to look at that history of sexuality, because you see the coming together of all these different things. The first medical textbooks that are being written about what sexuality is as a sort of driving force, which obviously would then go on to influence psychoanalysis and things like this. Then the criminal discourse, which you alluded to earlier, and the move from the Buggery Act, which had been implemented under Henry VIII in 1533, in which sodomy was a crime, with quite strict limits on proving it. There was a very high burden of proof. Anal sex had to have occurred, and there had to be ejaculation inside the anus, and there had to be a witness, a third-party witness. So it was quite hard to actually convict people of this, and the reason the bar was so high was because the punishment up until the early Victorian era, or the 1820s, was death. It then changed to life imprisonment. But this is still based around sex acts, whereas what you see, as you mentioned, in the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 was an attempt to criminalize this type of thing, to criminalize gayness in a funny way, to say it's not just someone sodomizing someone else, which should be illegal, but it's people cruising, and it's all these guys hanging around in toilets who are chatting each other up and going to these bars. This is a thing. We don't quite know what it is, but we know we don't like it. We've got to stop it. So they introduced this bizarre law, very, very bad piece of legislation, because, as you mentioned, it doesn't actually define what gross indecency is. So that is left up to the judges, which means that perhaps Henry Labouchere, who was the Liberal MP who introduced it, who knows quite what his reasons were for introducing it, But perhaps it was intended to have a tighter remit, but in the end, it ended up criminalising people for, patting somebody on the knee in a theatre, or looking funny in a public toilet, or skulking around parks at night, for example. And this law continued right into the late 20th century. So it's a really fascinating point of history. And I think what was really interesting for me that I learned in studying it was the third aspect of this. So you have the criminal, you have the medical, but then you also have the cultural, which is men emerging at that time who recognize themselves as this type, and rather than run from it, attempt to build some form of community around it, some sort of cohesive social identity. And a social identity that isn't based around purely this idea of immorality, but has some higher ideals. And so this is the start of what we today probably call the identity of the gay man. And you see that especially in the higher echelons of English society, in educational institutions like Oxford and Cambridge. And Oscar Wilde is obviously a sort of patron saint of a lot of gay men, precisely because he was one of the first people to sort of verbalize and elucidate that this was a sexual identity, and that it was a positive thing and noble, and followed in the path of these great historical figures, like Plato or Hadrian, or all these sort of figures from the past, Michelangelo. So that was what's so fascinating, is that right in the middle of this moral panic, there emerged these people who wanted to positively identify with it. And this wasn't just an upper class thing, and as Cleveland Street sort of proves, as there was a homosexual demimonde, but it was a world with relationships and cultures and rich social understandings of actually very complex interrelationships between sex and gender and things like this. And out of this sort of melting pot where people are sort of feeling around in the dark to try and figure out what's actually happening in society, you start to get the development of the sort of modern homosexual identity. I guess one of the interesting things, James, about the Cleveland Street scandal is precisely that it was a scandal. And I'm kind of interested in what you see as that sort of relationship with the press, and whether there are any sort of similarities we could draw with what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, it's sort of the place coming on at a really mad, well, not like a sort of interesting time. Like, one of the big things I'm not sure we've mentioned yet with Cleveland Street is that there were lots of rumours went round that Prince Eddie, also known as Prince Albert Victor, who was the Queen Victoria's grandson and second in line to the throne, was a client at Cleveland Street. And that's one of the reasons why the scandal, both there was a scandal and the scandal implies a cover-up. And we've just last year, we just had this sort of enormous outpouring of kind of grief and pomp and ceremony for the death of Queen Elizabeth II. But in the previous few years, all of the talk about the royal has been about various scandals to do with either their sex life or their love life. They have these lives, particularly when you're not on the throne, where you can't really do much else, and your life isn't really defined by much else other than, and so the place where you can fuck up is in your romantic life, who you marry and what happens in your marriage, or your sex life, or the sex scandals you can get embroiled in.
Because I think you can look at the sort of history of sexuality as being the development of the sexual subjects in the West as being a series of moral panics. So the homosexual emerges from this moral panic, which is partly around prostitution in the late 19th century, and then in the 1950s there's another moral panic. In the 80s there's a moral panic, and we're going through a moral panic again. And all these are driven by the press. But what's really interesting about it is they always in some way backfire, because because these identities are constantly in flux and being produced, the more you publicize their existence, the more people identify with them. So actually, things like the Wilde case and the Cleveland Street scandal brought into the public imagination the idea of the homosexual, which drew a lot of men to it. And the same in the 1950s, which the sort of prosecution of people like Lord Montague and Peter Wildeblood for having a sexy time, a nice holiday at the coast with some boys, some men. That drove a sort of, again, the 1960s sort of liberalization of homosexuality as more people identified with it. And then again in the 80s around AIDS and stuff. So I think if you look at a history of sexuality as like a series of fluxes of moral panics coming and going, it's not even that we are, that there's similarities between this moral panic and that, but in a way, it's just an extension of a 2-century-old moral panic that continues today. And one thing that's quite interesting is in the press in the last couple of years, you've seen a lot of a return of this figure of the gay man as a predator, which I think is riding on the back of a lot of anti-trans discourse. But you see in the UK cases like Philip Schofield and Huw Edwards, where there's a huge moral panic around the idea that these men are sexual predators, even though they're men who are having sex with other men over the age of 18. This idea that especially older gay men as someone who predates on younger men and corrupts them is a part of this same long moral panic that we're going through. So James, your play takes all these true historical stories and narrativizes them and dramatizes them as a sort of creative, semi-fictional work, I guess. What are the challenges in doing that, and especially in depicting real life characters like Charlie or Prince Albert Victor or even Queen Victoria?
I think we always wanted the play very much to be very willfully like a retelling or reimagining, or do you know what I mean? Like it's not. I think anybody coming to see The Flea and expecting it to be a perfectly made historical retelling of the Cleveland Street scandal is going to be disappointed. And I'd encourage everybody coming to read around the subject and to look at. There's been so much interesting stuff written around it, but the play itself is, by its very nature, is always going to involve a bit of creative license and imagination. And so the way I sort of approached it was to try and, because you do feel a responsibility to, even though these people all exclusively are long dead now, you do feel a responsibility because they were alive and they did go through something approximating the story that we're telling. And so I kind of thought about the kind of leaps of where I zeroed in on accuracy and where I took kind of leaps of imagination. I felt more comfortable going bigger and bolder with those in power and those maybe who we know more about in the history books. I'm not going to damage Queen Victoria's reputation, do you know what I mean? Because there's been thousands upon thousands of things written and made about her. And one of the reasons why I wanted to tell the story is there's very little in the way of portraying the life of the Telegraph boys, who ultimately, as you said, were the only ones that ended up doing prison time in the whole thing. And, you know, as the play shows, the scandal impacted lots of different people up and down the chain in various different ways, a lot of them negative, but it was only the boys at the very bottom that ended up seeing the inside of a cell. And so I sort of wanted to root the play and the story of a son and his mother and really look into what their life might have felt like economically, socially, like how their relationship might have existed, and like what might have driven someone like Charlie to both like work as a telegraph boy, but then take this extra step of working somewhere like Cleveland Street. And so for them, and they're the characters I kind of hold very dear and close in terms of how we're representing them, because I feel like no one else has really done that. And then the more I get up to Bertie, the Prince of Wales, and Queen Victoria, the play's allowed to breathe out a bit, I think, because history can take that. There's a lot of different sort of, you know, very willful like genre nods. We've got this incredible creative team working on the show, which are making the most amazing, you know, set design, costume design, like sound design, these sort of astonishingly beautiful creations that are going to make the play feel like it's really, I think, hopefully really rooted in both those sort of genre elements I was talking about, but also contemporary queer performance culture. And I think the sort of the mishmash of the two things, the script I've written and the sort of astonishingly exciting design choices, are going to make something really, really special and unique, I think.
History is in some ways an attempt to understand what happens through the creation of narratives. And I think the subject you've chosen is really fascinating because gay history is especially like that. I mean, the story you're telling is amazing because we have so many rich records of what happened, and that's because it was a criminal case. And so much of the telling of gay history in the UK and in Europe and the US is basically a charge sheet. So that's all we know of gay history, is the people who are arrested for it, and not what was actually happening in terms of the personal relationships and the culture of homosexuality that existed at the time. So you have to take not liberties, but you have to make creative suppositions when thinking about gay history, because the records aren't there. So when it comes to telling these stories, I think there's actually a space in telling a sort of fictionalized version or a based from true life story. There's a space to really try and explain and understand the different ways that people lived that aren't recorded necessarily in a historical record, or that you have to dig for in a historical record. To take this crime sheet, which just says this thing happened, this act happened, and this is the crime that was committed, and say this is the context in which it happened. These are the ways that these men were living their lives, and when you start to do that, there's a lot of similarities there between gay history and writing fiction about history, which is about fleshing out and putting some meat on the bones of the dry facts to explain the human impulses that made people do what they do.
The Flea is not, as I've said, is not a historically accurate retelling of the Cleveland Street scandal. There are plenty of flights of imagination that I've put in there, and the design is not a perfect recreation of Victorian London, because that's not what we were interested in doing. What would you say, as somebody who clearly loves and thinks deeply about history and historical writing, to encourage someone to read more history?
Well, first off, I think I wouldn't encourage them to read more history unless they want to. I think that's like part of the problem with the way we experience it is we're sort of told that it's like a beneficial thing for your health to read history and to make yourself smarter in that way. And as a result, people feel that they have to go a certain route into reading history. They have to know everything about, the broad thing first. I can't read this thing until I know everything about the Victorians, or I can't read this thing about the Romans until I know everything about the Romans, and that was boring for me at school. Rather, just find a story that you're interested in. If something catches your eye from the past. And my own approach to thinking about history is it's kind of like this huge quilt of understandings, and there's like fine bits and there's big bits, and the more you read and watch and learn about history, and where you visit places and you understand things, once you start to put these things into context, it's a quilt that gets richer with more and more things that are added. So when you understand one part of it just as a fascinating story, but then you start to understand the economics or the press, in this case, for example, or its relationship with the medical establishment or colonialism, all these sort of things knit together, and your understanding gets sort of deepened throughout all your sort of reading of history. But the first place to start is with stories, and the stories that you personally find interesting. And it doesn't have to be a scandal. It can be perhaps you visit somewhere and there's like a historical house and you're like, this pattern on this chair is amazing. This wallpaper is amazing. And you go and look up who makes the wallpaper. Then you learn about William Morris, and you learn about arts and crafts and socialist design and all these sort of things. You just pick the thing that interests you and let your curiosity take you somewhere. You don't have to know everything and get everything on a big level before you start to learn the small stuff.
Totally echo that. I think the thing why we've always been fascinated in it is because it's the same reason why we write drama, is that we want to know a bit more about who we are, I think. Do you know what I mean? And like how the hell this mad thing we've created works.
How did we get here? How
did we get here? Why am I doing this? Do you know what I mean? And one of the best ways to do that is to retrace our steps. And I think how you do that is exactly as you say. It's completely up to you, because there's a million different journeys going back that way that you can take, I think.
Well, the story you're talking about really is the relationship between groups of really horny men. It's about sex, and it's about characters, and it's about like the stupid things people do when they really want to get laid, or when they're filled with desire for other people, and that's like the story behind it. So it's a story that's ripe for retelling in theatre.
Yeah. So if all this sounds interesting. Please come and see The Flea at the Yard Theatre.
Yeah, and if you're interested in the historical background of the case and some modern stories, there's actually a chapter in our book, Bad Gays: A Homosexual History, which is out now, about Jack Saul, who was a very fascinating Irish rent boy who was implicated in the Cleveland Street scandal. And he also was said to be the author of an amazing book of Victorian pornography called The Sins of the Cities of the Plain, which is hot but also hilarious.